My old army friend Walt Higgins turned 91 this year, and for 3 months, a woman he trusted completely had been quietly emptying his bank account $50 and $80 at a time, small enough that he never noticed, until I did. My name is Frank Delgado, 73 years old, retired Army Master Sergeant, and I want to tell you about the last man from my original unit still living within driving distance of me, and about the caregiver who nearly took everything he had left. Walt and I served together for 9 years, starting in the early 70s, 2 young logistics sergeants who learned the trade side by side before our careers eventually took different paths within the same broader field. We stayed close across the decades that followed, closer than most men manage with anyone outside their own family, the particular bond that forms between people who've depended on each other's competence in circumstances where mistakes carried real consequences. Walt was best man at my wedding to Rosa. I was best man at his wedding to a woman named Dorothy, who passed 11 years ago, 2 years before my own Rosa passed, leaving both of us widowers navigating the particular loneliness of outliving the person you'd built your entire adult life around. Walt has no children, a fact that became increasingly significant as he aged into his late 80s and his health began the slow, uneven decline that comes for most of us eventually if we live long enough to experience it. He'd had a hip replacement 2 years ago that never fully restored his mobility, arthritis that made simple tasks like opening jars or buttoning shirts genuinely difficult, and a mild but real cognitive slowing that his doctor described, during one appointment I attended alongside him, as normal aging, not dementia, but enough to make daily life more complicated than it used to be. About 8 months ago, Walt decided, after considerable resistance and several conversations where I gently pushed him toward the decision, to hire in-home care rather than move into an assisted living facility, a choice I supported because I understood how much his independence and his familiar surroundings mattered to his overall well-being, even as I recognized the genuine risks of an elderly man living alone with a hired caregiver largely unsupervised. He found a caregiver through a local home health agency, a woman named Patrice Coleman, 44 years old, with what appeared to be solid credentials and positive references from previous clients. She came recommended by the agency's placement coordinator as someone with particular skill working with elderly veterans, a phrase that, in retrospect, I've thought about often, wondering whether it reflected genuine expertise or simply practiced familiarity with a demographic she'd learned, over time, how to successfully manage. Patrice began working with Walt 5 days a week, mornings through early afternoon, handling meal preparation, medication management, transportation to medical appointments, and, increasingly over the following months, small errands that expanded to include grocery shopping and eventually, at Walt's own initiative, limited access to his debit card for those grocery runs and other minor purchases, a level of trust that developed gradually as Patrice proved reliable across the early months of their arrangement. I visited Walt every other Sunday, a routine we'd maintained for years even before his health decline made these visits feel more genuinely important, driving the 40 minutes to his house to share a meal, watch a ball game, talk about old times in the particular unhurried way two old soldiers can talk when there's no urgency pressing on the conversation. Patrice typically wasn't present during my Sunday visits, her schedule running Monday through Friday, which meant I only knew her through what Walt told me about her, consistently positive, appreciative of her patience and competence, grateful, in the way lonely elderly people often are, for regular, attentive human contact beyond occasional family or old friends. About 3 months ago, during one of our Sunday visits, Walt mentioned, almost in passing while we watched a football game, that he'd need to transfer some money from his savings into checking because his checking account balance had gotten lower than I expected, probably just all these little grocery runs adding up faster than I'm tracking. I didn't think much of this comment initially, the kind of offhand remark elderly people make about finances without necessarily indicating anything concerning, ordinary confusion about tracking expenses rather than evidence of anything wrong. But something about the specific phrase lower than I expected nagged at me quietly through the following 2 weeks, the particular instinct I've developed, across 18 years of Army logistics work, for noticing when someone's casual description of a financial discrepancy might actually be masking something worth closer examination. On my next visit, I asked Walt, as gently and non-alarmingly as I could manage, whether he'd mind if I looked over his bank statements with him, framing it as simple friendly assistance rather than suspicion, an offer to help an old friend stay organized rather than an investigation into anyone's conduct. Walt, who'd never been especially attentive to detailed financial tracking even in his younger, sharper years, welcomed the help genuinely, pulling out a folder of unopened statements from the past several months that had simply accumulated without his full review. What I found, going through those statements with the same methodical patience I'd once applied to Army supply manifests, troubled me immediately. Walt's checking account showed a consistent pattern of small cash withdrawals, typically $50 to $80, occurring 2 to 3 times per week, alongside his regular, explainable grocery and pharmacy purchases. Individually, each withdrawal looked unremarkable, the kind of routine cash access an elderly man's caregiver might reasonably need for small incidental purchases. But the cumulative pattern, added up across 3 months, totaled just over $11,000 in withdrawals that Walt, when I asked him directly about specific dates and amounts, couldn't account for or connect to any purchases he actually remembered authorizing. Patrice usually just tells me she needs a little extra for this or that, Walt said, genuine confusion crossing his face as we reviewed the pattern together. I trust her judgment on the small stuff, Frank. I can't always remember the specifics myself these days, you know that. I kept my voice carefully neutral, not wanting to alarm Walt before I understood the full scope of what we were looking at, the same measured approach I'd learned to apply across several difficult family situations over the preceding couple of years. Walt, I want to look at your savings account too, if you'll let me. Just to make sure everything's tracking the way it should. His savings account revealed something considerably more troubling. 3 transfers, each for $5,000, moved from savings into checking over the preceding 2 months, transfers Walt genuinely didn't remember authorizing, though he acknowledged, with visible distress, that Patrice had helped him set up online banking access several months earlier and had, on at least one occasion he could specifically recall, walked him through some routine account maintenance on his laptop that he hadn't fully understood at the time but had trusted her guidance on, the way he trusted her judgment on most practical matters by that point in their working relationship. I want to be careful here about how I characterize what I was seeing, because I understood, even as the pattern became increasingly clear, that jumping to accusations without solid evidence risked destroying Walt's trust in a caregiver who might, despite the concerning numbers, have entirely legitimate explanations I hadn't yet considered. So I did what I'd done in previous situations involving Preston's foundation and, later, involving Cole's business dealings, I began building a careful, methodical understanding of the actual facts before drawing any conclusions or taking any action that couldn't be walked back. I asked Walt for permission to accompany him to his bank the following week, a request he agreed to readily, genuinely wanting to understand what was happening with his own money regardless of what that understanding might reveal about someone he'd come to trust. The bank's branch manager, a patient woman named Carol Nishimura who'd worked with Walt for years and clearly held genuine affection for him as a longtime customer, pulled detailed transaction records covering the full period Patrice had been employed, records that revealed a pattern even more concerning than what I'd found in Walt's own unopened statements. Beyond the cash withdrawals and savings transfers, there were 4 instances of what the bank system flagged as card-not-present transactions, online purchases totaling just over $6,000, made through Walt's debit card but processed through websites he had no memory of ever visiting, purchases that, when Carol helped us trace the specific merchant names, turned out to be for items entirely inconsistent with Walt's known needs or interests: designer handbags, a laptop computer, and a series of gift card purchases from major retailers, the same untraceable, difficult to reverse instrument I'd encountered in an entirely different fraud situation involving my son-in-law's foundation months earlier. Total losses: once Carol had finished compiling the complete picture across cash withdrawals, savings transfers, and unauthorized online purchases, came to just over $38,000 over the 3 months Patrice had been managing increasing access to Walt's finances, a devastating sum for a man living on a fixed military pension and modest savings meant to sustain him through whatever years remained of his life. Walt sat in that bank conference room, staring at the printed transaction summary, and I watched something break in his expression that I recognized from decades of friendship: the particular devastation of a proud, independent man realizing he'd been deliberately deceived by someone he genuinely trusted with his daily well-being. How could I not have noticed this, Frank? How did I let this happen? You didn't let anything happen, I told him, keeping my voice steady despite my own controlled fury at what we'd uncovered. Someone deliberately exploited your trust and your memory difficulties. That's not a failure on your part, Walt. That's a calculated choice on hers, if what we're seeing turns out to be what it appears to be. I want to be precise about the if in that sentence, because even with this substantial evidence, I understood that a formal accusation required certainty rather than strong suspicion, and I insisted, before we took any further action, on giving Patrice a genuine opportunity to explain the discrepancies, in case some legitimate explanation existed that I simply hadn't yet considered. I arranged, with Walt's agreement, to be present during Patrice's next scheduled visit 2 days later, a decision I made carefully, wanting to observe her reaction directly rather than relying entirely on a second-hand account of however Walt might handle the confrontation alone. Patrice arrived at Walt's house at her usual time, and I watched her expression shift, subtly but unmistakably, when she saw me sitting at Walt's kitchen table alongside a folder of printed bank statements. "Mr. Delgado," she said, her voice carrying a careful, measured tone I recognized immediately as the particular caution of someone quickly recalibrating their approach to an unexpected situation. "I wasn't expecting you today. Walt asked me to help him review his accounts," I said, keeping my own tone as neutral and unhurried as I could manage, giving her every opportunity to respond honestly before I revealed how much we'd already documented. "We found some transactions that don't quite make sense to either of us. I was hoping you might be able to help us understand them." I watched her carefully as I walked through the pattern: the cash withdrawals, the savings transfers, the online purchases for items entirely unrelated to Walt's known needs. Her initial responses followed a familiar arc I recognized from other difficult confrontations across my life. First, casual dismissal, suggesting Walt himself must have simply forgotten authorizing routine expenses. Then, as the specific dollar amounts and dates made that explanation increasingly implausible, a shift toward defensive justification, claiming she'd used some of the cash for supplemental caregiving expenses she'd apparently decided, entirely on her own judgment, were reasonable, without ever discussing them with Walt or documenting them in any way. "The online purchases," I said, sliding across a printed page showing the designer handbag purchase, "were shipped to an address in Mesa that isn't Walt's home. Can you help me understand that particular transaction?" Patrice's composure finally cracked, the careful professional demeanor she'd maintained across 8 months of employment giving way to something more raw and defensive. "You don't understand what this job actually involves," she said, her voice rising slightly. "The pay from this agency is barely enough to live on, and Walt's got more money than he even knows what to do with at his age." I wasn't hurting him. He never even noticed. The admission, delivered in that moment of frustrated defensiveness, confirmed everything the documentation had already strongly suggested. I felt Walt stiffen beside me, the particular pain of hearing someone he'd trusted with his daily care openly rationalize having exploited that trust. "Walt trusted you with his well-being and his finances," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger I felt on my old friend's behalf. "Whether he noticed isn't the measure of whether what you did was right, Patrice. $38,000 is not a supplemental caregiving expense. That's theft from a 91-year-old man who served this country for over 3 decades and deserves considerably better than having his trust weaponized against him." I contacted the home health agency that afternoon, providing the documentation Carol Nishimura had helped compile, and the agency, to their credit once presented with clear evidence, terminated Patrice's employment immediately and cooperated fully with the police report Walt and I filed the following day, providing her complete employment file and confirming, through their own internal review, that this wasn't Patrice's first position with concerning financial irregularities, though previous concerns at an earlier employer had apparently been resolved through quiet termination rather than formal legal action, allowing her to continue working in home care without any lasting professional consequence until the situation finally created a documented paper trail serious enough to prevent that pattern from simply continuing indefinitely. The criminal case against Patrice moved forward over the following months, eventually resulting in a plea agreement. Given the clear documentary evidence, restitution ordered for the full $38,000, though Walt's attorney was realistic with us both about the genuine likelihood of ever collecting the full amount from someone with Patrice's limited financial resources, alongside a suspended sentence contingent on completing that restitution and a permanent bar from working in licensed home care positions going forward. Walt hired a new caregiver eventually, through a different agency and with considerably more oversight structure in place this time, including an arrangement where I review his account statements monthly, a routine that's become, in its own way, simply another dimension of the friendship we've maintained across more than 5 decades, one old soldier looking out for another the way we once looked out for each other in circumstances neither of us could have anticipated when we first met as young logistics sergeants learning our trade side by side. I keep thinking about how long this could have gone on if you hadn't caught that one offhand comment about her checking account being lower than expected, Walt told me, some weeks after everything had settled, sitting on his porch together the way we had 100 times before across our long friendship. "I might never have noticed on my own, Frank. Not the way things are with my memory these days." "That's exactly why you've got people around you who are paying attention," I told him. "That's what this is for, Walt. Not just watching football together on Sundays. Actually watching out for each other, the way we always have." If this story reminded you that elderly people, even sharp, independent ones, deserve someone actively paying attention to the details of their care and finances, share it with a family member who might need the reminder to check in more closely. And if it touched you, subscribe for more stories about family, quiet vigilance, and the particular loyalty that lasts a lifetime.